Thunder on the Right by Alan Crawford. Read by Fax Fivem. Chapter 11. The Politics of Grievance. Opening with the following quote.
Mistrust those in whom the impulse to punish is strong.
From Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. If the heart of the New Right is in Orange County, California, its brain is in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and its Northern Virginia suburbs. There the leaders of the New Right live and work as they direct their attention to the national scene. While theirs is a grassroots movement, the leaders urge their foot soldiers to focus their fire upon their senators and congressmen and on the White House, where national policy is made. The New Right organizations are scattered throughout Capitol Hill area, many offices within walking distance of the Capitol, with New Right businesses, probably for tax reasons, situated in such northern Virginia suburbs as Vienna, Fairfax, and Alexandria. The Richard A. Viguerie Company is located in Falls Church, Bruce Eberl and Associates in Vienna. For the New Right leaders who rise early from their apartment houses in Virginia, life is a series of committee meetings, luncheons, receptions, dinners, and conference calls. On Monday, they attend the so-called Pack Luncheon, a meeting of the leaders of rightist political action committees held at the Key Bridge Marriott Hotel across the Potomac from Georgetown. On Wednesday, they attend a breakfast at Viguerie Company headquarters. On Friday, there is a planning session for the week's legislative activity held at the Kingston Room of the Congressional Hotel in Washington. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, they can often be seen at the Capitol Hill Club, the dining room of the Republican National Committee headquarters, discussing strategy with GOP New Rightists in the ambiance of white tablecloths and black waiters, or downstairs chatting over burgers and beer at the club's grill. Busy at all times, the New Rightist professionals are an aggressive, competent, and dedicated corps of skilled political organizers, bright though anti-intellectual. They no longer think only in terms of electing or denying election. Their strategy is to take control of all branches of government, the courts through constitutional amendment, the Congress by legislation and election, the executive by one day winning the White House. They seek to mobilize on the local, state, and national levels to pressure their elected officials in Washington to push for local and state referenda, initiatives, and constitutional amendments to limit taxes, restore the death penalty, and bring prayer back to the public schools. They encourage their supporters to deluge Capitol Hill with postcards and letters expressing approval or opposition to legislation. Once sympathetic congressmen are elected, they are encouraged to attend intensive training sessions conducted by the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress. Their performance in office is closely monitored. The New Right has formed two unofficial Republican groups, the Republican Study Committee of the House and the Republican Steering Committee of the Senate, paid for by participating GOP members, roughly $100 a month, to provide legislative research and direction to cooperating congressmen. Groups like the Heritage Foundation produce studies to support the New Right's positions. The New Right stay busy on other D.C. fronts as well, working through groups like the Reverend Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority to broaden the constituency for so-called social conservatism, encouraging actions in Washington on issues like abortion, school prayer, and gay rights. Other organizations like the National Right to Work Committee build support for their positions by purchasing advertisements in mainstream and even liberal publications like the New Republic to broaden the constituency of their cause. Still others, like the American Conservative Union, conduct frequent press conferences to get their views into the newspapers and to create the image of a strong dissenting voice to the policies of the current Democratic administration or the opposing Republican Party establishment. The result is a surging undercurrent of political activity which touches many fronts, mobilizing many individuals and affecting in countless ways the attitudes and activities of elected officials. Electoral victories. Throughout the mid and late 70s, the New Right made great gains in both houses of Congress, by 1980 holding about 40 of the 435 seats in the House and 10 of 100 seats in the Senate, controlling, therefore, about 1/10 of both houses. The 10 New Right senators are all Republicans. Jesse Helms of North Carolina and James McClure of Idaho were elected in 72. 2 years later, Jake Garn of Utah joined them. In 76, the new right elected Orrin Hatch of Utah, Harrison Schmitt of New Mexico, and Malcolm Wallop of Washington. In 78, the right gained Gordon Humphrey of New Hampshire, Roger Jepson of Iowa, and William Armstrong of Colorado, and re-elected Helms and McClure. The 5 winning new right candidates may have benefited from low voter turnouts customary during off-year elections. As Maurice Rosenblatt of the Committee for the Study of the American Electorate told the New York Times, the nation
may be losing the votes of the broadly concerned citizen, leaving the fields to those motivated by narrow, parochial, and emotional interest.
Richard Stout, writing as TRB in The New Republic, concluded that Jepson's election was a direct result of this trend. If those in office continue to win re-election, and if the right elects new supporters at the current rate, it would control almost a third of the Senate by the mid-'80s. The new right made steady gains in the House as well, and by 1980 they could claim to have elected about 40 congressmen. In 1969, Illinois Republican Philip Crane was elected, an orthodox Republican who became a new right leader when Richard A. Viguerie's power began to increase. Others clearly part of the new right include Jim Jeffries, a Republican from Kansas, and Martin Leaf, a Democrat from Texas, elected in 1978, as well as L.A. Skip Bafales of Florida, Robert K. Dornan of California, Mickey Edwards of Oklahoma, George Hanson of Idaho, Henry Hyde of Illinois, Bob Livingston of Louisiana, Larry McDonald of Georgia, J. Kenneth Robinson of Virginia, Eldon Rudd of Arizona, and Steve Sims of Idaho. In Texas in 78, the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress and the National Conservative Political Action Committee, true to the new right's tradition of backing Democrats and opposing so-called blue-stocking Republicans, supported Democrat Kent Hance over Republican George Bush Jr., son of the 1980 presidential hopeful. The new right senators and congressmen have come overwhelmingly from the South or West. 9 of the senators hail from the West, only one, Gordon Humphrey of New Hampshire, elected to represent a New England state. In the House, the South and West also dominate with small delegations from the Northeast. Behind-the-scenes leaders. A number of self-appointed leaders not ever elected to public office, though some have run and been defeated, are the real heads of the new right. The elected officials very often appear not to be leaders, but so-called followers out front. Though tied to the direct mail fundraising business, they use their position with PACs and lobbies to politic. 3 fairly representative of the new right leadership are Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, Howard Phillip of the Conservative Caucus, and John T. or Terry Dolan of the National Conservative Political Action Committee. Of divergent backgrounds, one the son of a German immigrant to Wisconsin, one the son of a Boston insurance broker, and one middle-class New Englander, all have come together to advance the politics of grievance, committed to bringing the new right to power, but with little idea of where they actually want to lead. The program of the new right, said Terry Dolan, would entail sweeping changes to the political system. The new right is radical, Weyrich said.
In the same way that FDR's Young Brain Trust was radical, committed to sweeping changes and not to preserving the status quo.
Phillips holds fairly standard right-wing views on major policy questions, but is more radical than Weyrich or Dolan, favoring
a return to biblical law.
Beyond broad support for increased defense budgets and slashing welfare expenditures, new right leaders seem impatient with the intricacies of public policy. Weyrich, for example, is a self-described
political mechanic
with little knowledge of or interest in public policy and political thought. The personal power of these 3 leaders is, in part, a function of who they know and what they are willing to do to advance the new right. A cherubic man whose choir boy appearance masks a gift for political hardball, Weyrich described by associates as
the foremost survival artist in Washington,
owes much of his leadership to his association with brewer Joseph Coors. He met Coors when he was a press secretary to Senator Gordon Allott of Colorado. As his unofficial agent in the Capitol, Weyrich convinced Coors to underwrite the Heritage Foundation and the Committee for the Survival of Free Congress. He instilled himself as a paid employee of both organizations. Phillips, for his part, worked closely with Viguerie on conservative caucus activities. In 1977, he helped draft a House resolution calling for the impeachment of UN Ambassador Andrew Young. The bill was introduced by Larry McDonald of Georgia, the John Birch Society member. McDonald's move was synchronized with the mailing of 400,000 conservative caucus fundraising letters, resulting apparently in a hefty return. Paul Weyrach's roots are in the German immigrant communities of Wisconsin. He represents a direct link to the isolationist, populist, Germanophile roots of the New Right. His father, he told me, was
a great admirer of Robert Taft.
Beloved by Wisconsin immigrants, of course, for his staunch opposition to United States involvement in the Second World War. He was influenced, he said, by Robert Taft.
I read everything he wrote.
Taft wrote a short tract on isolationism, titled A Foreign Policy for Americans, his only book except for a collection of his speeches. Howard Phillips was educated at Harvard and is probably the brightest of the three, but he has changed his opinions so frequently, associates say, that it is difficult to find any philosophical consistency in them. An outspoken right-winger when he served as Harvard's student body president, he earned a reputation as an equally outspoken liberal when he was chairman at 23 of the Boston Republican Party. In 1968, he managed the successful senatorial campaign of liberal Republican Congressman Richard Schweiker of Pennsylvania, but when Schweiker was selected as Reagan's running mate, Phillips denounced the choice as corrupt and distributed press releases that pledged Phillips to
work for the Republican Party's defeat if its appeal to the electorate is premised on the embrace of Great Society liberalism reflected in Dick Schweiker's Senate voting record.
Phillips was not even a member of the Republican Party at the time, having left the GOP in '74 to re-register as independent. He changed his registration again in 1978, this time to seek unsuccessfully the Democratic senatorial nomination from Massachusetts. As he explained to Conservative Digest,
my loyalty is not to a political party or a personage, but to a set of political principles.
David Brudnoy, a libertarian writing in National Review, observed that Phillips, in order to deride Elaine Noble, another Democratic candidate,
imported Anita Bryant to sing on his behalf, but the concert tickets wouldn't sell. Of 5,000 seats, less than 3,000 appear to have been sold, despite weeks of heavy advertising, and a small number of militant homosexuals went whooping against Miss Bryant. This allowed Phillips to cancel the concert and get what he announced he needed, front page and prime-time TV coverage. But while Massachusetts isn't really the most liberal state in the Union, Bay Staters were not buying the cynical Phillips ploy. Phillips came in way down just above Elaine Noble, the Democratic senatorial candidate by a narrow margin, 36 to 31%, over State Secretary Paul Guzzi is Congressman Paul Tsongas. Both are rated perfect by ADA. And that November, Tsongas defeated Ed Brooke, the Republican moderate.
It is difficult to determine what Phillips's so-called political principles are, given the frequency with which they seem to change. He did tell me that the only answer for America was
to resort to biblical law,
but was unable to tell me how this could be accomplished, or by whom. In November of 1977, Dolan was involved with then Young Republicans Chairman Roger Stone in an independent campaign to defeat Henry Howell, a Democrat then seeking the Virginia governorship, a campaign so tawdry that the Republican opponent, John Dalton, disavowed it. Dolan had formed the Independent Virginians for Responsible Government. Dolan acknowledged that the effort was to defeat the Democrat.
We don't care about Dalton,
Dolan said. Virginia Congressman J. Kenneth Robinson signed a letter written by Dolan and an associate that called the opponent a radical and distorted his position on busing. This letter was mailed throughout Virginia. Dalton called on Dolan's group to cease its activities, calling it
unnecessary and counterproductive.
At least 2 television stations in Roanoke had refused to air the commercials. Dolan is a soft-spoken young lawyer who talks tough when the subject is direct mail, which keeps his organization afloat.
Let's get rid of the bastards,
is the pitch of his organization's fundraising appeals as he described it to me.
To make 'em angry, stir up hostilities. We're trying to be divisive. The shriller you are, the better it is to raise money.
Throughout their political organizations and PACs, Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, Nick PAC, and Conservative Caucus, these three behind-the-scenes operators, Wyrick, Phillips, and Dolan, made many of the key decisions in the 76 and 78 elections, determining the amount of money to be contributed by new right groups, selecting and placing field organizers in the campaigns, and providing direction in the fields of campaign management, press relations, and advertising. The Politics of Revenge, 1978. The right had been buoyed up in 1976 when Orrin Hatch, a political novice, defeated three-term Utah Senator Frank Moss with a direct mail campaign that put the goal bluntly.
The union bosses told the workers, "We're going to blow your heads off."
New rightists geared up for 1978 and took on three incumbents in the East, Midwest, and West, with well-financed and hard-hitting campaigns. All three were new right victories, the elections of Roger Jepsen in Iowa, Gordon Humphrey in New Hampshire, and William Armstrong in Colorado. In all three races, liberal Senate incumbents were defeated with a strong showing by single-issue voters. The most striking of these victories was by Roger Jepsen, who ousted incumbent liberal Democratic Senator Dick Clark. A strong anti-abortion following teamed up with the fundraising efforts of the Viguerie Company to put the lieutenant governor from 1968 to 72 and businessmen, marketing, electronics, and insurance, over the top by 28,000 votes. Clark, with 100% ratings from the Americans for Democratic Action in 75 and 76, had angered right-to-lifers by voting for federal funding of abortions, declaring that his conscience prevented his supporting a constitutional ban on abortion. Singled out specifically for extermination by the National Right to Life Committee, Clark was relentlessly pursued by the powerful Iowans for Life, who had earlier shown their political clout by denying the Democratic nomination of Lieutenant Governor of Iowa to a popular pro-choice woman candidate.
"We're going to defeat the bastard,"
one local anti-abortion activist told a visiting journalist, and on the Sunday before Election Day, anti-abortion activists handed out 300,000 leaflets in the parking lots of Roman Catholic churches urging Clark's defeat. Clark, identified by Congressional Quarterly as the most liberal member of the Senate, was under fire from a wide range of other rightist groups, particularly the gun lobby and those angered by his support of the Panama Canal Treaties. Polls showed Clark ahead by 10% up to the day of the election, but Jepsen, backed by the National Conservative Political Action Committee and the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, won by 26,000 votes, or 51%. The victory may have also had an indirect push from straight-ticket voting, led by votes for popular Republican Governor Robert Ray, no rightist, who ran nearly 67,000 votes ahead of Jepsen. In addition, the state GOP organization was strong. In 78, for example, it retained control over both houses of its legislature, the first time it had controlled either in 4 years. Still, abortion remained the deciding factor. A Des Moines Register survey showed that about 25,000 voters, many of them Democrats who otherwise would probably have voted for Clark, voted for Jepsen on the abortion issue alone. He won 20% of the Democratic vote. Jepsen did well in traditionally urban Democratic strongholds, especially with Roman Catholics. Jepsen backed with large contributions from major rightist groups in Washington, TRB reported in The New Republic.
Snatched the Republican nomination from his rival in the primary, where only 17% turned out. Once nominated, Jepsen achieved a coalition of single-issue minorities, the anti-abortion lobby, the gun control lobby, and the like, which gave him 26,000 votes over Democratic liberal Dick Clark. Of Jepsen's total vote, 25,000 came from the Right to Life group, according to the Des Moines Register. If more people voted, the passionate single-interest minorities would be less powerful.
Carter softened the blow by appointing Clark as ambassador-at-large on refugee problems, but in late 1979, Carter abruptly resigned to join Ted Kennedy's presidential campaign. Jepsen was quoted in an interview a few months later about the triumph. He explained it as part of a conservative surge against liberal control of Congress.
The people have had enough. They are conservatives for change. That's what I am, a conservative working to change this intrusion by government into our personal and business lives. The voters can change things through our system of elected representatives, and there are many additional avenues for redress of grievances. Americans can change things for the better if they will just work at laying the educational groundwork. Iowans supported keeping the Panama Canal, yet my liberal opponent, Dick Clark, voted in favor of paying the Panamanians to take it off our hands. The great majority of the people in Iowa have a strong family life and want to send their children to the school of their choice, but my opponent was champion of forced busing and similar interference with parental authority. I have great faith in the judgment, the common sense, the inherent intellect of the American people. When you give them the facts, refusing to be what some people call a Me Too Republican, they came up with the right decision. The key is education, leveling with the American people. When they ask, "Well, why are you a conservative?" I tell them, I am a conservative because I am for change. And then I point out that we've had total liberal control of government all these years while the liberals have created all the things people are practically up in arms about. Suffocating regulations, inflation, confiscatory taxation, ever more government involvement in people's lives. I repeat that I am for change and ask, is there something wrong with that? Usually they'd say, well, gee, I'm against those things too. And I say, that's right, you're a conservative and you didn't even know it. Welcome aboard. Now here's what you can do to help.
Another clear-cut 1978 victory for the forces of the New Right was the defeat of incumbent liberal Senator Floyd K. Haskell of Colorado by three-term Republican Congressman William Armstrong. Haskell had defeated conservative Republican Senator Gordon Allott in 1972, establishing himself as a liberal. He received a 100% rating from the Americans for Democratic Action in 76. But he had done little to impress himself upon Coloradans. Shy, soft-spoken, and often awkward with meeting his constituents, Haskell was no match for the aggressive Armstrong, an outgoing, born-again Christian who campaigned on standard conservative issues, charging that Haskell had lost touch with the attitudes and concerns of his constituents. A footnote here reads the following. Haskell was hurt by his close association with President Carter, who had vetoed a public works bill containing water projects important to the state. Conservative Digest thought anti-Easternism and anti-elitism were dominant in the Colorado race, saying the following.
Despite substantial immigration from the East in recent years, Colorado remains essentially a Western state with the West's buoyant extroversion and skepticism of big government. So it is no wonder that Senator Floyd Haskell, with his aloof, pipe-smoking professional demeanor, a string of pro-big government votes that earned him an abysmal 11% rating from the American Conservative Union, and a cultured Eastern accent developed during years of studying at Harvard and living in New Jersey, is in trouble.
The New Old West was riding again. Haskell attempted to portray his opponent as too far to the right.
On the fringe, a minority of a minority.
For Colorado, but the voters disagreed, giving Armstrong almost 60% of the vote. New right PACs had contributed $1 million to the Armstrong campaign. Haskell raised $600,000 for the race from various liberal PACs. The third of the New Right victories was the New Hampshire election of Republican Gordon Humphrey, the former Allegheny Airlines pilot whose only political experience before running for the Senate was as a conservative caucus organizer. He defeated the older, aged 63 and tired, incumbent Democrat Thomas McIntyre by about 4,000 votes. McIntyre later groused that he had been defeated by the sinister forces of the radical right, led by Manchester Union leader-publisher William Loeb. Indeed, McIntyre wrote a book on the subject called The Fear Brokers. He neglected to mention, however, that Loeb was unable to engineer the re-election of his political crony, former Governor Meldrum Thompson. It is probably more accurate simply to conclude that McIntyre was out-campaigned, though not outspent, by his more youthful opponent, who made much of the liberal Democrats' unpopular support of the Panama Canal treaties. Despite what Marquis Childs has called McIntyre's
stand against the radical right,
his campaign was listless and without much conviction. Some of the most stunning reversals in American politics during 1978 took place in states where the electorate was moving to the right and its mood detected by moderate politicians of both parties or Democrats of the right. In Minnesota, for example, the seemingly unconquerable Democratic Farmer-Labor Party of Eugene McCarthy, Walter Mondale, and the late Hubert Humphrey was rocked by the Republicans, who elected 2 senators, their first in 26 years, and handed the governor's mansion to a Republican as well. In the heaviest non-presidential election in the state's history, Republicans Rudy Boschwitz and David Durenberger defeated liberal Democrat Wendell Anderson and conservative Democrat Bob Short, and Congressman Al Quie defeated incumbent Governor Rudy Perpich for the State House. When President Carter selected Walter Mondale as his running mate and Hubert Humphrey died early in 1978, liberal energy was severely depleted in the state. Governor Wendell Anderson resigned his post, putting in the top spot Lieutenant Governor Perpich, who promptly appointed Anderson to Mondale's vacant seat. With Muriel Humphrey appointed to succeed her husband, 3 of the top Democratic officials in the state were unelected. Quie, seeking the governorship on the Republican ticket, bought devastating billboard ads reading,
something scary is going to happen to the DFL. It's called an election.
Facts 5 from here. I just want to say for anyone confused, in the state of Minnesota, the Democratic Party is technically called the Democratic Farmer-Labor Party, hence the term DFL. Amusingly, this is not the only state Democratic Party with a different name. The North Dakota Democratic Party is, quite literally, I kid you not, called the Democratic Nonpartisan League Party. Nonpartisan Party.
An era has ended,
said Theodore Mitau, a respected political scientist and former chancellor of the state's university system after the election.
This is part of a broader wave of anger, a frustration at inflation and high taxes which is sweeping the country.
The Democratic Farmer-Labor Party, internally divided over such emotional issues as abortion, women's rights, and gun control, all of which the new right took a passionate interest in, defensively developed a strong conservative wing led by a millionaire businessman. In a stridently conservative senatorial campaign, Robert Short defeated liberal Congressman Donald Frazier, Humphrey's heir apparent, for the Democratic nomination. Iowa right-to-lifers, in an assist to Short, deluged the state with the same brochures they had used to defeat Senator Dick Clark in their own state. Having won the primary, Short failed to get the endorsement of his party's official structure in the election itself, but he had successfully knocked the liberal Democrat out of the race. The Republicans had offered 3 attractive moderates: Boschwitz, a plywood salesman and emigre from Nazi Germany, Durenberger, an aide to Minnesota's last GOP governor, and Quie. Waging an aggressive but well-tempered campaign, in no sense right-wing, the Republicans carried traditional Democratic areas against rightist Democrat Short, who lost by 2-1, and acting Governor Perpich. Boschwitz made great signs by stressing the fact that Anderson, once a popular governor, arranged for Perpich to give him his appointment to the Senate. He also publicized Anderson's attendance record, the second lowest in the Senate.
First he appoints himself to the job,
Boschwitz would say,
and then he doesn't show up for work.
The victory of the moderate Republicans was impressive. The New Right's so-called victory had consisted of denying victory, with the help of the Iowa right-to-lifers and New Rightists, to liberal Democrats. In Massachusetts in 1978, liberal Democrats were stunned in the primaries when incumbent Governor Michael Dukakis, earlier believed in his first term to be a rising power on the national political scene but increasingly under fire, was soundly defeated in the primary by Edward J. King, a maverick rightist Democrat who assailed Dukakis for raising taxes after a vow that he would never do so. Embracing Proposition 13, King also urged that the drinking age in Massachusetts be raised to 21 and that capital punishment be reinstated. All of this appealed to the increasingly right-wing blue-collar voters of the Bay State. In the November election, with support from the Republican New Rightists, King defeated his opponent Francis Hatch. Rightists in the state helped deal a fatal blow to the Republican liberal. The right gave its major attention, however, to purging the Senate of Edward Brooke, the Senate's only black and a moderate Republican. They succeeded in their purge only to share responsibility for election of an even more liberal Democrat to Brooke's seat. The articulate anti-busing leader and television commenter Avi Nelson, ignoring the advice of cooler heads within the Massachusetts GOP, who advised him that he was a shoo-in for Congress from anti-busing South Boston, took on the assignment of challenging Brooke for the Republican Senate nomination. Earlier, New Right leader Howard Phillips ran in the primary and lost badly. Reaganite GOP State Chairman Gordon Nelson, no relation, argued that the conservative Republicans should not challenge Brooke since the state organization was working diligently to court black voters. He reasoned that the party should support Brooke and back Avi Nelson for the South Boston congressional seat. With Richard A. Viguerie handling the fundraising, Nelson raised about $400,000, much of it from national rightist groups and Viguerie's operation. Avi Nelson tore into Brooke to the delight of the new rightists. He opposed legalized abortions, the Panama Canal treaties, forced busing, racial quotas, and supported a tax cut and capital punishment. The new right opposition to Brooke is suggested by a fundraising letter sent to Republicans in Massachusetts in '78, signed by new rightist Republican Congressman Stephen Sims of Idaho. It charged that Brooke had
done a great deal to oppose conservatives,
and had voted much of the time with Edward Kennedy, the state's
Mr. Liberal.
8 GOP senators, outraged by this opposition to the Republican incumbent, filed a former protest with Republican National Committee Chairman Bill Brock against the cannibalism implied by the Sims letter. Brock agreed.
Our diversity can be our greatest strength,
he said. When Nelson was defeated by Brooke in the primary, Human Events responded in disappointment and anger, charging that GOP leaders had
sandbagged Avi Nelson's chances,
as if they should be expected to abandon their support of an incumbent GOP senator. Nelson, the Weekly reported,
can rightly blame Republican officials both within and without the state for helping to squelch his promising political chances, and many of those who did him in were conservative U.S. senators such as Jake Garn, Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah, and John Tower, Republican from Texas.
Their sin was to sign a letter in support of Brooke. Badly damaged by the primary challenge and by revelations of his false statements on property related to his divorce settlement, Brooke went down in defeat to Paul Tsongas, his Democratic opponent, in November. The GOP lost a seat, and they lost it to a Democrat more liberal than Brooke, and strongly backed by incumbent Senator Ted Kennedy. In Illinois in '78, rightists sided with a Democrat against an incumbent Republican Senator, Alex Seif, a corporate lawyer, graduate of Yale and Harvard Law, had been nominated by the Democrats to oppose Charles Percy. He was to the right of the Republican moderate Percy. He opposed federal aid to education, for example. He ran a hard-hitting, indeed ruthless campaign against Percy. Conservative columnist George Will found the contest
especially interesting because Seif was supported by some of those wrecking ideologues who operate at the fringe of Republican politics. They keep busy by admiring one another's conservatism and by posing as custodians of the party's purity. Their special delight is charging that Republicans who disagree with them are not true Republicans. The support such people give to Seif in his reckless, destructive campaign strips them of all claim to their chosen role as arbiters of republicanism.
Anti-ERA activist Phyllis Schlafly, whose headquarters is in Alton, Illinois, sent hundreds of letters urging Percy's defeat. Columnist M. Stanton Evans stepped out of his role as journalist to tape radio spots endorsing Seif's candidacy. The Schlafly letter attacked Percy for his support of extension of the deadline for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment,
eager to cram the ERA down our throats,
and the Panama Canal treaties, and linked the senator with
The drug-peddling, pro-Castro Panamanian dictator.
She told Chicago Sun-Times political editor Basil Talbot that Seath, too, could have supported these same policies as Percy contended he had, but that it made no difference to her.
It's he who sticks the knife in that inspires the resentment,
She told him. Once again, revenge was the motivation. The campaign was orchestrated by campaign consultant Tony Schwartz, an advertising specialist responsible for those 1964 television ads that depicted Barry Goldwater as, in the words of Human Events, a nuclear madman. One of his commercials, aired in black communities, began as such. Before I continue, I just want to give a little bit of context for what he is referencing. During the 1964 presidential election between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the most famous ads of the time was the Daisy ad, in which a young girl, I forget if she was named Daisy or if she was playing with the Daisy, was just adorably counting down. Then you hear, kind of a very loud voice counting down and leading to a nuclear explosion. And the ad talked about how Barry Goldwater could not be trusted with control of America's nuclear arsenal. There were probably some other ads that depicted Barry Goldwater as being irresponsible regarding nukes, but the Daisy one is the most famous. Feel free to look it up if you want. But I should say the reason that it is being mentioned is because in terms of political ads, that one is pretty famous. And, let's be real. How many political ads have people regularly talked about after the election was done?
Do you think Senator Percy is a friend of black people? Well, remember Earl Butz? He was that Secretary of Agriculture who made a racist and sexually obscene joke about blacks. We can't repeat his racist words on the air, of course, but they were so offensive that he had to resign. Maybe you are wondering what that's got to do with Senator Percy. Just this. Senator Percy said of Earl Butz, "I wish he was Secretary of Agriculture still today." Still today, Senator Percy? Percy wants the black vote. And with friends like this, you don't need enemies. Because Charles Percy tolerates the Earl Butz insult to blacks, more and more people are getting behind Alex Seath for United States Senate.
In fact, Percy had called for Butz's resignation immediately upon learning of the joke. Black leaders, angered over the false smear against a longtime friend of the civil rights movement, rushed to Percy's defense. Such tactics proved effective in some corners. So did public anger over Percy's liberal voting record. William F. Buckley Jr. called the campaign against Percy dirty. Percy, trailing Seath, counterattacked by scrapping his routine commercials and taping 30-second mea culpas, such as,
"The polls say many of you want to send a message, but after November 7th, I may not be in the Senate any longer to receive it. Believe me, I've gotten the message, and you're right. Washington has gone overboard, and I'm sure I've made my share of mistakes."
Seath, who enjoyed a substantial lead according to a Chicago Sun-Times poll, slipped behind the incumbent, in large part because of the nature of the campaign. The voters,
"Quite wisely,"
wrote Buckley, chose to send Percy back to Washington. Rowland Evans and Robert Novak drew ominous conclusions from the campaign.
Negative advertising,
and little else had propelled the anonymous Seath into his early lead, and only by turning Seath's own tactics into a campaign issue did Percy regain his strength. It had been a close call. In September of '79, Seath announced that he would seek the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate from Illinois again, attempting to take over the seat of retiring liberal Democratic Senator Adlai Stevenson. He planned to retain again the services of media advisor Tony Schwartz and to contribute less of his own money than he had in '78 when he contributed about $1 million. Though Phyllis Schlafly's bid to stop Senator Percy had been to no avail, her supporters were successful in helping the new right to win a congressional race in Illinois in '78. With the GOP nomination, Schlafly had won fully 47% of the vote in an unsuccessful 1970 challenge to incumbent Democratic Congressman George E. Shipley. Her home base in Alton was part of the state's 22nd congressional district before new boundaries were drawn, and the district was even more heavily Democratic than it is today. Central Illinois, then and now, is strong Schlafly territory. I probably shouldn't be asking this right now, but may as well. Do any of my listeners come from the Illinois area, and if you are, can you confirm if Central Illinois is then and now still strong Schlafly territory? Well, Schlafly did die relatively recently, I think 2016 or 2017. But, does her legacy still dominate Central Illinois? Let me know if you can. By 1978, Shipley had retired, and a coalition of conservative Republicans, Schlafly supporters, and right-to-lifers worked hard to take over the seat. The winner was Daniel B. Crane, a Danville dentist, whose brother Philip ran a long, if increasingly futile, race for the GOP 1980 presidential nomination. The Crane team was fueled by large sums of money from new right organizations. Working feverishly with right-to-lifers and Eagles, it put together a coalition that defeated a moderate Democrat, Terry Bruce, and replaced Shipley with a Republican. In New Jersey's Senate race in '78, challenger Jeffrey Bell waged a thoughtful and respectful contest for the Republican nomination and shocked the political world in the primary by upsetting aging veteran incumbent Senator Clifford Case. Bell strove to dissociate his candidate from new rightists, intent primarily, as he put it, on purging party liberals, but he knocked the liberal Case out of the contest. As so often happens in GOP primaries, the more conservative but less electable candidate won, and Democrats, running popular basketball hero Bill Bradley, were able to pick up the Senate seat from the Republicans in November. 1,043,184 votes to 813,381. Bell had moved to New Jersey in '76 from Washington, D.C., especially to run for the Senate, a decision that had met with ridicule in rightful circles in Washington. Lynn Nofziger, who had worked with Bell in the Reagan campaign of '76, has admitted that he told the youthful conservative
he was crazy
for making the presumably futile move, but Bell had sensed the temper of GOP voters in the state better than he. Bell had been a contributor to both National Review and to The Nation under Carey McWilliams. He had been an enlisted man in the Mekong Delta, an instructor in political science at Harvard, and once political director of the American Conservative Union. With the fundraising services of Bruce Eberl and Associates, the conservative intellectual unleashed a direct mail campaign which, over the signature of Congressman John Ashbrook of Ohio, asked readers,
Did you know there is a Republican senator who has a higher liberal rating than George McGovern, Hubert Humphrey, and Ted Kennedy? As a matter of fact, this Republican senator has the second highest liberal voting rating in the entire U.S. Senate. The far-left group, Americans for Democratic Action, measures all senators' support of liberal legislation, and this senator scored a 95% out of a possible 100, a score topped by only one Democrat in the Senate.
Within 2 weeks of the primary, a New York Times NBC News poll had showed the veteran senator with 50% of the vote and Bell with only 14. Case had the endorsement of 20 of 21 county chairmen, all 13 GOP state senators, and 26 GOP state assemblymen. Bell, however, calculated the party organization as inert. When the votes were counted, Bell was found to be correct. He won the primary with 51% of the vote, but with only 3,500 votes. A key factor was the low voter turnout, which in Republican primaries tend to favor the more ideologically conservative candidate, helping to deprive the Republican Party of the incumbent senator who had rolled up a record 780,000 vote margin 6 years earlier. It was another moral victory. The new right, beginning to sense a shift in the wind, began to help. William Rusher used his newspaper space, an October column reprinted in Human Events, to solicit money for the Bell campaign.
Money may make the difference in New Jersey race,
the Human Events headline said. It reported that conservative Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah now believed that with proper funding, Bell could beat Bradley. The The Human Events reprint included the address of the Bell campaign headquarters to make things easier for those who wanted to lend a hand. After his defeat, Bell became unofficial advisor to New York Republican moderate Congressman Jack Kemp. In Maine, the new rightists did their best to try to block the political career of self-described liberal Republican Congressman William Cohen. First step was the political extermination of liberal Democratic Senator William Dodd Hathaway, a Massachusetts attorney who migrated to Maine in '53. The chosen instrument was Hayes Gaggin, a 30-year-old Bible-thumping so-called constitutionalist conservative, but a college graduate who advertised attendance at Harvard and Oxford. A registered independent, small businessman, and state legislator, Gaggin announced his candidacy for the Senate on July 4, 1978, flanked by a replica of the Liberty Bell. Gaggin, described by Conservative Digest as
a convert from the liberal spending economics of Lord Keynes to the tax limitation economics of Arthur Laffer,
campaigned against the ERA and for the family. He was backed by the National Conservative Political Action Committee, the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, Young Americans for Freedom, and Richard A. Viguerie himself. Rowland Evans and Robert Novak reported that the objective of the Gaggin candidacy was to siphon off enough votes from Cohen to
guarantee the re-election of Hathaway, a liberal Democrat, over an impure Republican. That would wreck the Republican Party's most glittering prospect for defeating an incumbent Democratic senator and cripple Maine's GOP.
Cy Jolie, Maine's GOP committeeman, resigned his party post to back the independent New Rightist on the peculiar grounds that
I am a Republican and Billy Cohen isn't.
But Gaggin proved to be an implausible candidate. The New Rightist claimed conspiratorially that someone had doctored his campaign literature, subliminally printing the word sex across his photograph. Rejecting the
hotsy-totsy swinger vote,
Gaggin ran a poor third with 8% of the votes. Cohen had begun in the House as a liberal but moved gradually to the center. His record was almost above conservative reproach. He was endorsed by Reagan and Kemp. He opposed the Panama Canal treaties, receiving a solid 78% favorable rating from the defense-oriented, rightist-inclined American Security Council. A proponent of the Kemp-Roth tax cuts, he was certainly more personable and more conservative than liberal Hathaway, who had lost touch with the shifting views of Maine voters, concerned with taxes, government spending, and the like, and damaged by environmentalist opposition to his support of the Dickey-Lincoln Dam hydroelectric project. Cohen also assiduously cultivated the normally democratic but fiscally conservative Franco-American community. He won over Hathaway 57% to 34%. In the main effort, a Republican moderate had staved off rightist sabotage to unseat a Democratic liberal in the Senate. A similar effort was launched, with slightly less success, in Tennessee, where Senator Howard Baker had angered the right by his support of the Panama Canal treaties. Though Baker won easily, he was opposed in the election by Tom Anderson of the extremist right American Party of Pigeon Forge. Anderson, the American Party's perennial presidential candidate, and Jane Eskind got only 46,636 votes to Baker's 645,711. Again, a political debacle for rightist sympathizers. Conservative Democrats and more moderate Republicans thus were beneficiaries of the more conservative mood at large and of the New Right's politics of grievance, more precious to them than victory. The right launched a serious attempt in 1978 in Illinois to rid the GOP of one of its more liberal leaders, House Republican Conference Chairman John Anderson. It sponsored the 1978 Republican Party candidacy of the Reverend Don Leon, an evangelical minister of the Open Bible Church, against Anderson, the third-ranking Republican in the House, who had been the nemesis of the GOP right during his 9 terms in Congress. Anderson had not faced serious opposition since his 1962 election. Endorsed by such Republican luminaries as Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, and Howard Baker, Anderson was assaulted from the right for his support of gun control, for congressional pay raises, for public funding of congressional campaigns, and federal funding of abortion, and his sanction of the Panama Canal treaties. The conservative challenger also charged that Anderson was out of touch with his constituents, a feeling that was shared according to David Broder of the Washington Post.
Far beyond conservative circles.
Anderson was nearly upset in the primary when Leon won 31,326 votes to Anderson's 43,055, 57.9%, thanks to the strong backing, after an early hesitation, from the right-wing PACs, including the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress and NICPAC. Viguerie mounted a national direct mail drive for funds for campaign mailings in the district, but Leon was short on funds for his own campaign. It is still unclear whether Anderson won a majority of Republican votes, since under Illinois law, voters are allowed to cross over in the primaries. Human Events attributed Anderson's show to a 5,000-letter mailing to 1976 Democratic primary voters a week before the election. A similar conclusion was reached by the New York Times, which called its account of the contest,
Illinois Democrats help Anderson defeat a conservative challenge.
John T. Dolan of NICPAC said,
The Don Leon campaign is round one. John Anderson is wrong on too many issues ever to have a free ride again. He may get away with it this time, but he won't get away with it forever. Sooner or later, he's going to have to decide whether he wants to give up some so-called principles or give up the seat from that district.
Anderson, in 1979, announced that he would not seek re-election. The opposition from the right was wholly bipartisan. To paraphrase Disraeli, many conservatively inclined voters in 1978 seemed to prefer liberal men and Tory measures. Nevertheless, liberals and moderates like Percy and Anderson and Baker were put on the defensive for the first time, and in many races, tested liberals lost. Dukakis and Brooke in Massachusetts, Fraser and Perpich in Minnesota, Hathaway in Maine, Clifford Case in New Jersey, some of them to other liberals. In a column entitled Cannibals and Elephants, Kevin Phillips admitted,
The simple fact is that GOP conservative activists do not accept any common view of interest with the Percy Case element, nor do they want to be in the same party or be hamstrung by a label that tries to create community where there is none.
Commenting on primary upsets in the liberal states of Minnesota and Massachusetts in 1978, Senator George McGovern said,
When two liberals go down in states like Massachusetts and Minnesota, it cannot be ignored. You have to say the danger to liberalism is greater than it was.
Held together by shared hostilities, the strategists and politicians of the new right have waged campaigns that were primarily negative.
The Viguerie people address only those concerns which tend to stir up lower middle-class whites.
One American Conservative Union board member complained to me.
But they never address the more important concerns of Americans of all colors, such as income security and unemployment. Busing may be a legitimate issue, but busing per se is not.
David Keene told me. Keene was once an aide to Senator James Buckley and to Vice President Spiro Agnew, and managed Bush for presidential campaign in 1979 and 1980.
Our objection to busing should be that it represents the substantive issue of generalized government intrusion into all aspects of our lives, but too often it has been seized upon as the only issue.
The electoral adventures of the new right to date have concentrated more on defeating candidates they dislike than on electing leaders they support. They spent the 1976 presidential campaign attempting first to deny the GOP nomination to Ford and then to Reagan. They spent the 1978 campaigns attempting to purge moderates and liberals, pledged to defeat senators who voted for the Panama Canal treaties, the so-called litmus test, and to purge Republicans like John Anderson and to prevent the election of promising young leaders like William Cohen in Maine. New right leaders dissipated many of their energies upon efforts that seemed futile or, when successful, succeeded only in damaging the Republican Party. But the effort did not seem futile to the right.
The new right is determined systematically to oust Republican incumbents who do not agree with them on all issues at all times.
Longtime GOP activist J. Bryan Smith wrote in The Nation,
To hear its spokesman tell it, Ideologically awry Republicans are more evil than even the most liberal Democrats, so they raise their funds and plot their strategy, often brilliantly, in order to rid the GOP of its impure elements.
Human Events said of 1978.
What is of special interest about this election year is that leading Democratic politicians, many from states that normally tilt leftward, are running and winning on hard right conservative themes.
They rejoiced in the nomination of Democrat Robert Short in Minnesota,
who ran on a platform that Ronald Reagan might have found too militantly right-wing.
They relished the defeat in Massachusetts' Democratic gubernatorial primary of Governor Dukakis by a
conservative buzzsaw.
Edward J. King. The definition of victory to the right was satisfaction of grievance, however achieved and at whatever cost.
Rather than vote for that liberal John Warner,
said the wife of one political professional of the Virginia senatorial race, as she waited for the votes to be counted,
we wrote in Dick Obenchian.
Obenchian, who had received the GOP nomination, was killed in a plane crash weeks before. He was succeeded by Warner in a runoff election. Casting a vote for the dead man had no political effect, but given the new right psychology, it had a certain therapeutic and symbolic value. Later in the evening at the same party, when the returns were complete, the same young woman sighed in disappointment, but then shook her head with satisfaction.
Well,
she said,
at least we got rid of Brooke.